Welcome friends to lesson 4 of our Pointillism fruit project. I'm so glad you're joining me and we're ready to wrap up this amazing project. All of these projects are 4 lessons that you have to view in sequence, so hopefully you've been with me for the entire ride. Let me tell you what you're going to need as we finish up today's lesson. You'll need your painting so far as we've gone through several layers of Pointillism paint. You'll need your original fruit arrangement so that you can refer to it for color. You'll need your 6 colors and white of your acrylic craft bottles of paint. So that would be your primaries of blue, red, and yellow, and your secondaries of green, orange, and purple. You'll need a whole bunch of cotton swabs, at least 2 paper plates, waxy coated paper plates that we can use as palettes, and some paper towels or napkins. Great. So we've been working on this Pointillism fruit project in the style of the French artist Georges Seurat. And one of the things that we've been looking at is the Seine at La Grande Jatte as our sample painting. And this beautiful scene of this idyllic park shows the River Seine, which is the base color is blue, but within there we see a lot of different dots of other colors in order to get that effect of light, reflection, and shimmering of the water. And with our focal point of this large tree on the riverbank, we learned a lot about how shadow is delineated by this purple strokes, the cool colors, and how the light of the sun coming on the bark is shown by this white and yellow. Warm colors show where there's light, cool colors show where there's shade. So with our fruit, we're in the process of making sure our fruit looks realistic and showing all the colors that we can see. And today we're going to be finishing up with the highlight and the shadows. So those are the lightest values and the darkest values that you're going to have in your painting. So we talk about value. Value simply means light and dark. And when it comes to color, there are still values within color, not just black, white. So the darkest value of red would be maroon, really dark, dark, dark red, and a light value of red would be a very pale pink. So we want to achieve that change in value with our color as well, and the way that we do that is by adding the cool shade colors in concentration as our shadow, and we will add some white to be our highlight. So the first thing we have to do, friends, is set up our palettes. So just like last time, we're going to make a palette of cool colors and a palette of warm colors. The only difference is we're going to add white onto our warm palette. Now, we're at the final stages. We're going to be putting in some more layers of dots, but not a whole lot, so you don't need to make your puddles too big. We don't want to waste paint. About the size of a nickel. Now, acrylic craft paint that you buy at a local craft store is a water-based paint, which means you clean it up with water, which is great for when you're washing your hands or cleaning off a brush, but it also means it dries quickly. So if you take a long time, you might see that your paints would dry. The paint that Seurat used was an oil-based paint. And so he could take 2 years to work on things. It wouldn't dry very quickly, and so he could wipe things off. But it requires chemicals to get it clean. So we're not going to use oil paint. We're going to use a water-based paint. But I'm in a studio where there's a lot of bright lights, and so that means that my paints might dry out a little more quickly because it's warmer and brighter. So now you see I'm adding white in the center of my warm color palette, but not too much, just a small circle like that. Now black, the Impressionist artists really didn't use black. They felt that the world was filled with a lot of different colors, and they could achieve the effect of getting those really dark shadows by adding darker purples, darker blues, darker greens. So they really didn't use black very much, and we're not going to use black at all. Okay. So last time we were together, we added in some darker tones and additional colors into our fruit so that it looked dimensional. But we need to take it a step further. Now, do you remember when I asked you to step away from your painting? Take a look at it away and determine what you need to do next? Well, I did that with my painting, and I decided that my apple needs to be a much more intense red. So I'm actually going to add in another layer of red. So you determine if you need to do that with any one of your fruits. Perhaps you have an orange and you want to make sure it's a really intense orange and there's too much white space showing between your dots. For me, there's too much white showing between my dots of red. So I want to make sure it's an intense red. And I don't like this cotton swab. The ends are not really good for pointillism, so I'm going to pick out one where it's tighter. Can you see the difference in these two cotton swabs? This cotton swab, all the cotton on the ends is all frayed and puffed out. This is nice and tightly spun against the stick. That's what I want to use. I'll get a nice dot with that. I want to spread out my puddles, right, so that I don't get too thick of an application. There we go. And I'm actually going to go back in right over and add some more dots of my apple so that I can get a more intense red. I'm looking at my real apple for reference, and I can see that there's some highlights, meaning some shine on my apple. It's a much lighter area. Well, I don't want to go back and put more intense red in those areas. I want to keep that light so I can show the shine. But can you see how that's getting a much more intense red because I'm adding more dots on top? And I'm even going over some of those other color dots. Again, my eye will do some mixing since they're on top of each other. That's much better, a much more intense red. I'm liking that. And my edge up here where I'm against the pear, I want to make sure that it's really clearly outlined where the two fruit kind of come up against each other. Great. Okay, so now that I've kind of done a little color correction to my apple where it's a little more intense color, I'm ready to add in highlight and shadow. So for highlight, we're going to add white. But let me give you a caution about white. White is actually very intense, and so you use white sparingly. And that means not a lot of it. So I'm going to use this other end of my swab to spread out my white so that my puddle is not too thick. And for sure, I want to use a nice tight cotton swab so I can get small dots. And I'm going to dip into the white, and I have a nice small amount of paint. Because white is so intense, I want to make sure that my dots are small and a little bit spread apart. Otherwise, it just looks like I took away all that color I laid down. So I'm looking at the shine on my apple. You look at your fruit. Do you see an area that's lighter where there's some shine? Now, on my sample, my light source was coming from one direction. I have to go by the light here in the studio. Before you can add in a highlight, my friends, you need to understand the importance of knowing where your light is coming from, because the side that your highlight is on will be the opposite of where your shadow is. So if your highlight is on the right, your shadow will be on the left, or vice versa. If your highlight is on the left, your shadow will be on the right. So if you look at our example of our beautiful painting over here, the light was coming from the left, shining onto the bark of this tree, and so this is light on this side, and you can see the strong shadow is on the opposite side. So the light was coming from the left and the strong shadow is on the right. So I'm looking here at where my highlight is, and in this arrangement my highlight is on the right. So I take a small amount of white paint, and I can see it almost creates like a little square, so I'm making just a few dots, not too close together, and then there's another kind of little highlight here. And right at the top where the stem comes out, because the apple curves, there's a curve of highlight, so I'm making like a little ring of highlight there. And on the other side, I'm not going to overdo it. That's all I'm going to do on my apple because I haven't put in my shadow yet. And you want to make sure there's kind of a balance between your light values and your dark values. Now my pear has highlight as well. So my highlight is on the right. It almost is like a long line. And then right at the bulbous part of the pear, there's another highlight. So that's much brighter. So I'm going to add dots that are closer together there. And again, where the stem comes out, I see a little bit of highlight there. Are you able to find the highlight the lightest parts of each piece of fruit. I also have shine on my banana. So with my white, I'm going to go back and add, and actually right where the two peel sections kind of come together, there's some highlight. So I'm going to make a row of white dots along there where that's highlighted. And now I'm done with the highlight. So the highlight is always on the opposite side of your shadow because of the source of your light. So for this painting, my shadows are going to be to the left, kind of different than my sample based on where that lighting was. And I can see some strong shadows all shifting to the left. So how do you create the shadows? Well, we talked about it the last time we were together, using the cool colors. And so the fun about this is most people think of shadows as black, but we're going to use a combination of all three of our cool colors to make the darkest value on our painting, and that's our shadow. So I'm going to start off by spreading out my puddles of my cool colors, because these are all going to be my shadows. Great. With a clean swab, I want to carefully observe, and the first thing that comes to my mind is that deep shadow that's between the pear and the apple. Because those three fruit are close together, there's not a lot of light getting in between. So there's a very strong shadow underneath the pear. So that's where I'm going to go first. So I'm going to start with purple, and I'm going to make a row of very close together dots right under my pear, very close together, no space in between. Several kind of rows thick here of purple. And I actually see it's a little more to the one side based on the light if I look at the shadow. So that purple is probably about the right shape of my shadow, but it's not the right color or darkness, so I need to add more. So I'm going to flip over my swab, and I'm going to add right over top, I'm going to add blue. Now because the paint is still a little wet, they might do a little bit of mixing, but still they're going to be more optically mixed than anything else. And my third cool color is green. And the combination of all of these cool colors in little dots will create a nice deep shadow. Now, that's fine for the pear, but I need to make sure I get a shadow that is also that dark under the apple. To me, that shadow feels a little too intense in color. Blue, I need to dull it down. And how do you dull a color? You add the color opposite, the color complement. So I finished off with some green there, so I'm going to add that green's complement, which is red. And even though red is a warm color, I'm going to add just a little bit of those dots because I'm trying to dull the color down. Now our apple is red, and the shadows are cool. So the same thing, we're going to start with purple, very tight dots. So there's a strong shadow going to the left at the banana and the apple. It's not a very large shadow. And so I'm going to get very tight along the apple with the purple. And it's going to actually go right into the shadow for the banana. Those two shadows kind of run together. And I'm very careful to pay attention to the shape that the shadow makes. Have you done that? Have you walked along with a friend and your shadow is such a unique shape depending on the angle of the sun? Sometimes it's a very long shadow when the sun is low in the sky, but if it's noon or in the middle of the day, you have a very short shadow because the sun is right over top. It's fun to look at the shapes that shadows make. So I'm looking at the shape of my shadow here, and right underneath my banana, because my banana curves up so there's a little bit of a gap between it and the table, I'm adding just a little line, and it probably will go up about 1/3 of the way when I look at my shadow. And then it runs right into the shape that the apple shadow makes. Right up against the apple. And my dots are very close together because it's almost like a solid object, that shadow, all one color. But I don't want it to stay purple, so I'm going to add green and add in some dots of green mixed in with the purple. Not as close as I did the purple, a little bit more staggered. So careful observation is the key, my friends, because when you add in highlight and shadow, that's what makes something look dimensional and real. This is an important step. If you've done our Repeated Sweets project, we talked about the importance of shadow, that artist Wayne Thiebaud, and how that really makes the whole thing. Check out that project too. Okay, I think I need to add my third cool color here, and I'm keeping my shape, adding in this strong shadow. Now there are some secondary shadows because we're under studio lights, but probably where you are, you just have a single shadow from one light source. And I really want that shadow to be stark against that golden yellow banana. Now when I look back at this, and remember the importance of looking at a distance, right? So if I were to hold my painting away from me, I don't see enough contrast between my shadow and my pear. So I want to go back and fix that. That's the great thing about this, my friends. You can continue to work until you get it just right the way you want. So I really want to show that pear color. And when I look carefully now, a little bit of a light from the banana is bouncing back onto the pear. So there's a bottom edge to my yellow-green pear that is actually a little lighter than I originally painted. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to add in some small yellow dots so that the difference between my pear and my shadow is more apparent. And it's just a really small amount. This is the fun part about art, where you're looking and observing and changing and adding and fixing. I love that. Some people like to do that with cooking, changing up recipes, right? Do you like to do that? I like to do it when I'm painting or drawing, erasing, adding, trying something a different way. Now the last piece is our stems. They're dark, but they're like brownish gray. So that means we need to mix complements, but we're not going to mix on our palette. We're going to mix on our painting. I think for the pear, I'm going to mix the complements of orange and blue. You can take any two complements. The combination of those will get you what you want. So I think I'll start with orange. And we know it is a dark stem, right? I'm just going to make a few dots along the stem, a little wider at the top. Flip it over and add in my blue. I'm going to go back in with more orange. And there's my stem. How about for the apple, we do red and green. Those are complements. So dip my red. You might say, oh, but my apple's red. Yep. But when you're mixing complements in small amounts, that's the key, small amounts, they optically mix to be a very dull color. So now, take some green, small dots mixed in. Well, it does look brownish, but I still see too much red, so I think I'm going to add the other two complements, orange and blue, so I can really make sure this looks brown against that red apple. And then my orange. That was a little too much orange. Remember, it has to be in small amounts. That's how that works. Now we have to step back again, see if our shadows and our highlights gave us the effect that we want, and add in any other tonal changes in our fruit to achieve the impact. So I'm going to put it up here and look at it from a distance. Well, I think my stems are okay. The highlights seem fine, the shadows seem right, and we want to put it on a table surface to give it context. Now, when you're doing something like pointillism, you could fill this entire surface with dots. It would take you quite a long time, but I bet you it would be beautiful. But what we're going to do is called a suggestion. We're simply going to suggest a table that the fruit is on. So I didn't use very much orange in this composition, so that's the color I'm going to choose as my table line. So I'm going to use orange, and I'm just going to create a horizontal line about 1/3 of the way up of my tallest fruit. So whatever your furthest fruit is. And I'm going to do that simply by making a row of dots across. And then on the other side, make sure they're, it comes out like a line, so it's like a table line. And I'm going to concentrate more dots around the fruit, just a few, not too much, and then start to spread them apart as I go away. And this is just suggesting a table, which is often what the Impressionists did. They didn't draw something in full detail. They would suggest something. They would suggest a boat on the river. They would suggest a man in a hat at a distance. And that was the technique of the Impressionists. It's just a fleeting impression of something. So what you're doing is simply suggesting a surface that the fruit is sitting on. Look at this painting that Seurat did, also at Le Grand Jatte. He loved that park. And so this one is called Island of Le Grand Jatte. And you'll notice really strong shadows in here, cast by a very low sun. But he loved to watch how, as the sun moved, the shadows moved. Now here's what's interesting about Seurat. Seurat had to go out at a particular time of day to see the shadows as they were at that time. He would take cigar boxes and he would do oil studies inside the lid of the cigar box so that he could then close it and the oil paint would stay moist so he could always change it or work on it later. And that reminds me of a great verse I want to share with you in the book of James. James 1:7. It says, "Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of the heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows." See, shadows change depending on what time of day it is and where the sun is. In fact, if you go out and you stay outside for a long time, you can watch buildings, the shadows of the buildings, or your own shadow as it changes. So Seurat had to capture those moments very quickly, which is why he did those small studies on those cigar box lids, because those shadows were going to move. And he wanted to capture it at just the right time. But God doesn't change like shifting shadows. God is immutable. Have you ever heard that word? That means unchanging. And that's an amazing promise, that no matter what government is in power, or where you live, or the age you are, or what country you're in, other things might change, but God doesn't change. He is perfect and all-powerful and all-knowing forever, unchanging. What a great promise. Now, Seurat loved to work outside and then come back to his studio, but he was often very secretive. He didn't tell anybody what he was doing, and he liked to work on his own. In fact, I don't know if Seurat knew who God was and that God was immutable, unchanging. I do know Seurat died at a very young age of 31. They say, they don't know for sure, but they say that he caught a severe infection called diphtheria that was going through Europe at that time. And because he was so secretive, because he stayed by himself so much, he probably didn't go to a physician in order to have it checked out. It's a shame that he died at such a young age. So I hope you've enjoyed this project, but you don't just have to use a cotton swab and some craft paint. You can try this style with other tools. In fact, I have one here that was done with a magic marker, which has such a very fine point that the dots are really tiny, which means it's going to take a lot of time. However, you can get quite a lot of detail because of the fine points in terms of shadows and highlights and optical mixing of colors. And that's the effect that Seurat was trying to achieve in his pointillism technique. So what have we learned through this project? Well, we've learned about the isms, all of the art styles that came about, and how Impressionism came about because people wanted to capture the way light played with color, and how Seurat, coming at the end of the Impressionism era, wanted to explore even new techniques of how light impacted color. He developed the style known as Pointillism, where you use very small dots or the point of the brush in order to make strokes rather than full, long brush strokes. We learned about the color wheel, primary colors, secondary colors, color opposites called complementary colors, and the division of the color wheel into warm colors and cool colors. And we learned that you can achieve quite a lot with just those 6 colors and white, an infinite array of colors. God is amazing when He developed that. He created everything that we see around us, and we get to explore it through interesting techniques in art, including Pointillism. So I hope you've enjoyed this project, and I'll see you for the next See the Light Art Project.